Hello and welcome to the CIMA Hub's industry analysis for the operational case study of February 2017. I'm Hugo Newman and I'd like to thank you for choosing to study with us here at the CIMA Hub. Just to give you a bit of background before we begin, the CIMA Hub is an online tuition provider and we're exclusively dedicated to providing study materials and guides for the CIMA exams at every level, operational, management and strategic. One of the things that we're most focused on at the CIMA Hub, and one of the things that we believe differentiates us from other tuition providers, is that we want to give you, the student, the absolutely essential materials and information that you need going into your exams. So while other tuition providers can often overwhelm students with a huge amount of information and data and documents, we're committed to giving you smarter study solutions that don't disorientate you, that keep you calm and on track as you head into the exam period. So we'll help you to retain only the relevant information heading into the exam and to clear away all the clutter that you might get from other sources. So for example, with this industry analysis, I'm not going to start talking about the history of beekeeping and who the great beekeepers were and why beekeeping is important for the environment, etc., etc. Rather, I'm going to keep you focused on industry trends and features that we can use and that can directly influence and feed into Mavis Venderby's decision making going forward in this case study. That way you'll be better able to anticipate and prepare for the themes and questions that are likely to come up in the February case study. So head over to our website, become a member for free, and avail of the many free resources and guides that we have on offer and that we update regularly as we move into the case study exam period. So just quickly before we get into the meat of the analysis, let me just introduce myself. My name is Hugo Newman. I hold a PhD in public policy from University College Dublin. My research focused primarily on the interaction between political economy, economic growth and development, and institutional ethics. I work full-time for the CIMA Hub, and to find out more you can check out our About section on the website if you go over to thecimahub.com/about. So here's what we're going to look at in this analysis. In the first section we'll deal with general market trends and influences on the demand for beehives, both in the real world and how that might feed into then the case of Tuckland. The second section focuses more closely on the customers and the demographics of Tuckland, considering the differences between hobby and commercial beekeepers. In the third portion then of the analysis, we home in on some real world companies in the beehive industry, comparing and contrasting them with Mavis Venderby and thinking about how their methods and strategies might feed into Mavis Venderby's future path. And then finally, we'll synthesize everything that has come before and try to anticipate how this might influence the issues that arise in the case study in February. Okay, so let's get started. The company we're dealing with is Mavis Venderby, founded 70 years ago. It's a family business, and as you're aware if you've read the pre-scene, Mavis Venderby's revenue is entirely dependent on the manufacture and sale of beehives and beehive components to both commercial and hobby beekeepers. So one of the most important and obvious questions at the beginning is what are the main factors driving the demand for beehives? Now the customer segmentation will of course feed into this answer as we'll see further on, but certainly from the point of view of commercial beekeepers, the beehive market is heavily dependent on the market for beehive products, most importantly honey. And so to understand the demand for beehives, we should take a close look at the honey market, because if the prospects of the honey market look grim or negative, then of course this will have a negative impact in turn on the demand for beehives. So in an April 2016 article published in the American Bee Journal, the president of the Committee for the Promotion of Honey and Health, Ron Phipps, reports that prices in American and international honey markets have been collapsing, much to the distress of beekeepers and honest honey exporters, importers and packers throughout America and other countries. And he says that during the past 12 to 14 months, honey prices for many important and traditional origins have eroded by 40 to 50% of their previous levels. So this is a huge decline in honey prices internationally in the last 12 to 14 months. And according to Phipps, a number of factors are affecting this decline. He notes that China has increasingly been mass producing honey, and potentially, he says, in a dishonest way. According to his analysis, Chinese producers have been adulterating their honey with resin and other techniques, and Phipps notes a heavy interference from the Chinese government on this point. He says, in effect, they have been diluting their honey with sweeteners and other components, and though honey exports have increased globally by 61% since 2007, the number of beehives has actually been relatively flat in the same period, growing by only 8%. And he also notes that productivity per hive has actually been decreasing. Again, more or less steady numbers of beehives with lower productivity would lead you to expect, if anything, a decrease in honey exports. But of course the opposite is the case. 61% increase in global honey exports since 2007. So we have a kind of a discrepancy here, an anomaly. And this for Phipps supports the theory that honey adulteration and tampering is widespread within the honey industry. So this will be important when we come to consider competitors and innovations below, because this allows producers from China and from other emerging Asian markets to export more. But for honey purists, of course, these products often don't qualify, don't count as real honey. So this, of course, puts pressure on the price of mass-produced honey, the kind of honey that you might find in large supermarkets, for example, the squeezy honey that you will find on your average supermarket shelf. And this in turn may be a factor that informs why the proportion of, in terms of sales by value to commercial beekeepers has been falling for Mavis Venderby in recent years. And unless this trend reverses, coming from Asian markets and China in particular, we might expect the proportion changes to continue in this manner. Of course, these honey market trends may affect company decisions in a number of ways, which we'll discuss in more detail as we go through this analysis. Phipps also notes that honey is a small luxury product where often when prices are low, consumers perceive a lack of quality. Now this is interesting. In other words, there's an opportunity for commercial beekeepers here to insulate themselves somewhat from the downward pressure on prices coming from mass producers of honey in emerging Asian markets. If commercial beekeepers market their honey as a kind of artisan product with unique flavours and unique qualities. So in Tuckland's case, as indicated in the pre-scene analysis, or pre-scene I should say, on page 23, there is indeed an increase in Tuckland's appetite for homegrown honey in recent years. Okay, so let's focus now more closely on the characteristics of the customer base for beehives. The significance of the demographics in Tuckland for the beehive industry, and this is very interesting indeed when we look at the demographic features of Tuckland. And then we'll look in turn at some of the key differences between hobby and commercial beekeepers. So demographically, Tuckland is a highly unusual and perhaps even unrealistic market in many respects. Tuckland has a population, we're told, of 20 million. So it's around the size of an average European country. It's a little larger than, say, for example, the Netherlands at approximately 15 million. And we see from the pre-scene that 1% of the Tuckland population are hobby beekeepers. Now, if we look at comparable population sizes in the real world, this is an absolutely huge proportion of the population. There are no comparable proportions in the real world that we know of. We are therefore dealing with a highly, highly contrived, perhaps even artificial domestic marketplace for this industry. So we should bear that in mind throughout this industry analysis, that Tuckland is in many respects a highly unusual and atypical country. Just to get a sense of how large this percentage is, because I mean when we say 1% without putting it in context, that might not sound particularly significant, but let's look at, for example, at the United States. Now the United States has a population of around 318 million, and you might be asking, well, why am I comparing Tuckland, which is just a population of 20 million, to a country like the United States with 318 million? And the reason is because making this comparison really underlines and emphasizes just how large this proportion is. When you see that the numbers of hobby beekeepers in Tuckland are roughly the same in absolute terms as the number of hobby beekeepers in the United States. So according to one source, the United States has somewhere between 115,000 and 125,000 beekeepers in total. Now that's all beekeepers, hobbyists and commercial beekeepers included. The vast majority are hobbyists according to the survey data, so we might assume that around 100,000 of the beekeepers in the United States are hobbyists, give or take. So what percentage of the population is that? It's 0.0003% of the population. So now you can see just how exceptional Tuckland is by comparison, with a whopping 1% of its population being hobby beekeepers. So if you add to that the number of commercial beekeepers, which according to the pre-scene analysis honey farms are up 200% from 5 years ago. We're looking at an almost implausible proportion of the population employed in the beekeeping industry in Tuckland. So the conditions for beekeeping here must be absolutely near ideal and in many ways incomparable with other countries. So this might explain Tuckland's honey market's apparent immunity to outside pressures, as indicated in the article on page 23 of the pre-scene. They say that imports of honey have actually dropped significantly in 5 years by 20%. So this indicates, it could indicate a number of things, but what it most likely indicates is that the quality of Tuckland's honey, in compared to other honey from other nations, is very, very high, and this isn't surprising considering the proportion of beekeepers within Tuckland. These must be very favourable conditions for bees and for the production of honey. So again, despite the international pressures that would be coming from China and emerging Asian markets in general in the global honey market, we might expect this to have a relatively marginal impact on Tuckland's domestic market. Nevertheless, innovation and efficiency will still be urgent concerns for producers due to both internal features of Tuckland's market, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and commercial beekeepers who may be looking to, for example, mass export in ways that are price competitive to external markets. Now, one question which is not addressed or made clear in the pre-scene is what exactly is the difference between hobby beekeeping and commercial beekeeping? It may seem that there's an obvious answer to this question, that hobby beekeeping is just a hobby, whereas commercial beekeeping is for business. Well, I think that's an oversimplification in many respects, and actually it might surprise you to learn just how similar in many ways commercial and hobby beekeeping are. And this will be very important when we come to considering innovations in the beehive industry below. One reason it's an oversimplification is of course because hobby beekeepers are increasingly selling their surplus honey in greater numbers, primarily in local markets, but increasingly, as is indicated in the pre-scene, in a more mainstream capacity due to the increase in demand for homegrown products across the board. So even hobby beekeepers can have that commercial interest and commercial component. We're told in the pre-scene that the proportion of Mavis Venderby's customers in terms of sales by value has shifted towards hobbyists by 10% in the last 6 years, with sales by value to hobbyists comprising 50% in the year to the 29th of February 2016. Now, that may reflect the growing appetite for homegrown honey as hobbyists increasingly make inroads into the commercial sector and become more frequent customers of beehives. It may also, though, be a result of the marginal effect of lower international prices for mass-produced honey as commercial beekeepers export less to foreign markets and so scale down or scale back their operations a little bit. Now, another reason it's an oversimplification to say that hobby beekeepers are doing it just for a hobby and commercial for business is because it might surprise you to learn the extent to which the methods and techniques of commercial honey production are by and large the same as those we find among hobbyists. The only real big difference is often in terms of the scale of the operations. Now, what we're going to do, just to give you a sense of this and to illustrate this more clearly, is we're going to show you a few clips which really highlight the extent to which the methods and techniques of commercial honey beekeepers are on a continuum with, and in many ways the same as those we find amongst hobby beekeepers. And this is going to be important for a number of reasons when it comes to considering Mavis Venderby and their possible changes going forward.